The pool lights shimmered in the late Los Angeles dusk. Somewhere inside the home, a television murmured faintly, echoing laughter from a sitcom episode that had once made the man watching it a global star. But outside, by the water, silence pressed down like a weight. A neighbor's dog barked. A light flickered on. And then, a sound no one would ever forget. A splash, sharp and desperate. Then stillness. Within an hour, paramedics would be pulling the lifeless body of Matthew Perry, the man the world knew as Chandler Bing, from that pool. And the official report would stun fans everywhere, cause of death, acute effects of ketamine. But how did a man who had fought so publicly to overcome addiction, who had devoted his later years to helping others do the same, end up alone, in a backyard pool, poisoned by the very treatment meant to save him? Matthew Langford Perry was more than just an actor. He was a cultural touchstone. Born in Massachusetts in 1969, raised in Ottawa, Canada, Perry grew up navigating divorced parents, a blended family, and a gnawing sense of insecurity that would shape his life. He was funny, razor-sharp, even as a teenager. But alongside the humor came something darker, a desperate need to prove himself, to fill silences with laughter, to drown loneliness with applause. By the time he landed the role of Chandler Bing on Friends in 1994, Perry was already dabbling in alcohol and pills. Fame didn't quiet the demons. It amplified them. As the show exploded into global phenomenon, so did Perry's struggles. Hydrocodone, Xanax, methadone, at times, entire scripts of Friends episodes were shot with Perry barely remembering being on set. But he fought back. Rehab, relapses, recoveries. By his own count, he spent over $7 million on treatments across 3 decades. And unlike most stars, he didn't hide it. Perry wrote openly in his 2022 memoir Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing, I wanted to share when I was safe from going into the dark side again. He wanted to help. In his 40s and 50s, Perry founded a sober living house. He funded addiction programs. He became a quiet advocate for mental health. And though his body bore the scars, gastrointestinal surgeries, weight fluctuations, lingering pain, his voice carried hope. But in 2023, new pain treatments were on the horizon. Treatments that sounded scientific, therapeutic, even revolutionary. One of them was ketamine infusion therapy. By summer 2023, Matthew Perry's close circle noticed him experimenting with these infusions. Ketamine, long known as both an anesthetic and a party drug, had recently been repurposed in controlled medical environments as a breakthrough for treatment-resistant depression and anxiety. Clinics across Los Angeles were offering supervised 4 infusions, promising relief from suicidal thoughts, a lifted mood, a kind of chemical reset. For someone like Perry, who had battled both depression and chronic pain, the allure was obvious. Friends later told investigators that Perry spoke about the treatments with cautious optimism. They seemed to work, at least briefly. It helps, he reportedly said. It makes the darkness go away, just for a while. But ketamine is dangerous outside strict medical settings. Its half-life is short, meaning it metabolizes quickly. The autopsy would later confirm that the ketamine in Perry's system at the time of his death could not have come from his last supervised infusion, because that session had been more than a week earlier. Which meant only one thing, he had ingested it elsewhere, or by other means. Saturday, October 28, 2023. The day began normally. Perry played pickleball that morning at the Riviera Country Club, a sport he had taken up with almost obsessive dedication. Friends said he seemed tired, but cheerful. He joked, he rallied, he planned to play again the next day. By early afternoon, he returned to his Pacific Palisades home, a sprawling property with a view of the city. He sent messages to friends, ordered food, watched TV. To all appearances, it was just another weekend. But by evening, something had changed. At 4 p.m., his assistant left the house to run errands. By the time he returned, just after 4:30 p.m., Perry was missing. The house seemed quiet, the den empty. The assistant went outside, toward the pool. And there, floating face down in the water, was the man millions had loved. The assistant dialed 911 at once. Paramedics arrived at 4:55 p.m. They pulled Perry from the pool, attempted CPR, checked vitals. Nothing. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Police officers noted the environment: no alcohol bottles scattered, no drugs left lying in plain sight. The scene was strangely ordinary. But the silence was heavy, unsettling. The initial suspicion was drowning. But the medical examiner's toxicology report, released weeks later, told a darker story. High levels of ketamine. Traces of buprenorphine, a drug used to treat opioid addiction. Neither combination, on its own, should have been immediately fatal. But together, with ketamine's sedative effects, they could immobilize. In a pool, even shallow water becomes deadly. The examiner's words were blunt: acute effects of ketamine. In December 2023, the world learned what investigators already suspected: Matthew Perry hadn't simply drowned. He had been incapacitated, his body overwhelmed by a powerful dose of ketamine. But the haunting question remained. If his last clinical infusion had been more than a week earlier, where did that ketamine come from? And who gave it to him? The official cause of death was not drowning. Not cardiac arrest. The report was blunt: acute effects of ketamine. The world mourned the man who made us laugh. But investigators were left staring at the toxicology charts, asking the question that turned Matthew Perry's death from tragedy into mystery. If his last infusion had been days earlier, where did the fatal ketamine come from? In the days following the autopsy release, the media headlines were brutal. Ketamine killed Chandler. The dark side of Matthew Perry's recovery. But those who knew him best pushed back.
Perry wasn't a reckless partier in 2023. He was 54 years old. He was sober. He was proud of his advocacy. His friends' co-stars described him as healthier than they'd seen him in years. He had completed his memoir. He had even spoken of wanting to start a foundation. This was not a man on a binge. So why was ketamine in his body? Investigators combed through his routines. Perry had been open about using ketamine infusion therapy for depression and chronic pain. Done correctly, these treatments are administered in controlled clinics by licensed anesthesiologists, using 4 lines and precise dosing. Patients are monitored for heart rate, oxygen levels, dissociation. Perry had been undergoing such treatments, but his last session had been over a week earlier, too far in the past for the drug to still be in his bloodstream. That raised 2 chilling possibilities. He had been self-administering ketamine outside of a clinic. He had obtained it from an unlicensed or underground source. Detectives found no force setup at his home. No infusion chair, no monitors. Instead, they discovered prescription bottles for buprenorphine, the opioid dependence medication also detected in his system. These were legally prescribed. But ketamine? None was found in prescription form. It had to have come another way. Toxicologists studied the blood levels. Perry's ketamine concentration suggested a recent ingestion, possibly orally or through injection. The sedative strength was such that within minutes, he would have been disoriented, unable to move with coordination. Combined with buprenorphine, his breathing would have slowed, his reflexes dulled. And then came the pool. Paramedics confirmed he had no external trauma, no foul play. He had simply been incapacitated by drugs, and drowned. But the question investigators couldn't ignore was this: how did he get it? The DA maintains strict controls on medical ketamine. It's not a prescription you take home. Clinics administer it on site, which meant the supply in his system that night had either been smuggled from a clinic or purchased illegally. Perry's assistant told police that he had run errands earlier that day. When he returned, Perry was unresponsive in the pool. He insisted there were no signs of distress before. No one else had been in the house. Phone records were reviewed. A few text exchanges about food delivery, nothing alarming. No evidence of shady contacts. Yet one unanswered call stood out. Perry had dialed his therapist earlier that afternoon. Investigators never revealed the content of that call. Meanwhile, fans worldwide struggled with grief. For decades, Matthew Perry's battles with addiction had been public knowledge, but many believed he had finally conquered them. The autopsy shattered that illusion, not because he had relapsed into old drugs, but because he was experimenting with something new. Ketamine was supposed to be the future of mental health therapy. Now it was tied to one of Hollywood's most tragic deaths. By December 2023, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner officially ruled: cause of death, acute effects of ketamine. Contributing factors, buprenorphine and drowning. Manner of death, accident. The case was closed. But behind the clinical language, haunting questions remained. If ketamine saved lives in clinics, why did it kill Matthew Perry at home? And had the line between medicine and misuse been crossed by the very treatment meant to heal him? Ketamine. To some, it's a miracle. A lifeline for depression when all else fails. To others, it's a party drug. A hallucinogen. A powder passed around in clubs. And for Matthew Perry, it became something else entirely, the chemical that ended his life. But was Perry's death an outlier, an accident born of bad timing? Or did it expose a dangerous flaw in how this so-called wonder drug is being used? By the time Matthew Perry tried ketamine therapy, it was being hailed as revolutionary. Traditional antidepressants can take weeks to show effect. Ketamine, by contrast, can sometimes lift depression within hours. Clinics across Los Angeles marketed it as cutting-edge treatment. Celebrities whispered about it. Wealthy clients paid thousands for a cycle of infusions. The process was clinical, hooked to in-4 drip, lying back in a recliner, doctors monitoring vitals. Patients described dissociation, vivid imagery, a strange floating sensation. Then hours later, a lightening of mood. For Perry, who had wrestled with anxiety, trauma, and chronic pain, the promise was hard to ignore. Friends said he often spoke of finally finding something that worked. But ketamine's rise carried warnings. Scientists stressed that its effects were temporary. Infusions had to be repeated. The risk of dependency loomed. And outside the walls of a licensed clinic, doses became unpredictable, even lethal. The medical examiner's report created confusion. Perry's ketamine levels were far too high for a controlled infusion. And the timing didn't match his last clinical session. It had been more than a week earlier, long enough that none of it should have remained in his system. That gap raised troubling possibilities. Was Perry self-medicating with ketamine obtained illegally? Was someone supplying him doses outside of clinic walls? Or had he found another practitioner willing to bend the rules? The truth was never revealed. But experts who reviewed the case noted the stark reality. Ketamine, once confined to hospitals, had spread into boutique clinics, private homes, and underground markets. And Perry may have become caught between the promise of relief and the peril of access. Toxicology revealed more than just ketamine. Perry had buprenorphine in his system, a legitimate medication prescribed for his opioid recovery. On its own, buprenorphine stabilizes. But combined with a sedative like ketamine, it slows breathing, reduces reflexes, magnifies risk. Investigators concluded that the mixture had likely incapacitated him. His body, heavy and unresponsive, slipped beneath the water before he could call for help. In other words, Perry didn't overdose in the classic sense. He didn't take too much intentionally. He became trapped in a chemical crossfire. The revelation set off ripples beyond Perry's death. News outlets published think pieces about the safety of ketamine therapy. Some framed him as a victim of experimental medicine. Others accused him of relapse. Clinicians defended the drug. Ketamine works, one doctor said, but it must be monitored. What happened to Matthew Perry is exactly why it should never be taken outside a clinic. Critics countered. Ketamine clinics had exploded too quickly with too little oversight. In California alone, dozens of boutique practices advertised miracle cures with minimal regulation. How many other patients were at risk? For fans, the nuance was painful. They wanted a villain, a clear explanation. But the truth was messier. Perry's death wasn't just personal tragedy, it was a symptom of a medical landscape rushing ahead of itself. By early 2024, ketamine therapy remained legal. Clinics stayed open. Demand only grew. Matthew Perry's name became shorthand for the risks, cited in debates among doctors and lawmakers. But the unanswered question still haunted his fans and investigators alike. Was Perry simply unlucky, caught in the wrong chemical storm, or was his death the warning sign of a wider crisis waiting to erupt? The verdict was in. Matthew Perry had not been murdered. He had not relapsed in secret binges. He had been undone by a chemical meant to heal him. The world wanted clarity. But what they got instead was something harder to accept. A man who fought so bravely against addiction, felled by a treatment that promised hope. And his death forced a question Hollywood, and the medical world, still struggles to answer. How do we balance innovation with safety, when lives hang in the balance? The official record reads like this. Date of death, October 28, 2023. Place, Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles. Cause, acute effects of ketamine with drowning as a secondary factor. Contributing condition, buprenorphine in system. Manner of death, accident. But paper records cannot capture the weight of the loss. Tributes flooded in. Lisa Kudrow called him brilliant, funny, and endlessly kind. Courtney Cox said she was so grateful for every moment. Fans across the world lit candles, shared stories, and revisited friends with tears. Yet alongside the grief came unease. Perry had been an open book about his struggles. He had survived near-death hospitalizations. He had spoken of being proud, finally sober, finally free. So why did it end this way? Experts pointed to ketamine's dual identity. In hospitals, it saves lives. In clinics, it can ease suffering. In nightclubs, it ruins them. It straddles the line between miracle and menace. Perry's case showed the danger of that duality. Because he wasn't a reckless addict in 2023. He was a man seeking relief, legally in good faith. Yet the very treatment that gave him hope carried the seed of his demise. And it wasn't just him. Studies revealed gaps in oversight. Clinics operated under loose standards. Doses varied. Long-term effects were poorly understood. Perry's death became a rallying cry for reform, but also a cautionary tale for patients worldwide. Investigators pieced together his final hours with precision. He played pickleball in the morning, ate lunch, messaged friends, watched TV, normal routines. But sometime between his assistant leaving and returning, he consumed ketamine outside clinical supervision. How he obtained it remains unknown. The dose overwhelmed him. Combined with buprenorphine, his body became too heavy, too still. He slipped under the water. No foul play, no conspiracy. Just a man, alone, with chemicals that proved stronger than even his will. It was the cruelest irony. By 2024, ketamine's reputation had shifted. For some, Perry's death became proof of its dangers. For others, it highlighted the need for tighter guardrails, not bans. Clinics tightened policies. Journalists investigated ketamine mills. Patients asked harder questions. And fans kept Perry's legacy alive. His memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing surged in sales. His sober living house continued helping others. His honesty about addiction, his willingness to make his pain public, became his lasting gift. Because in death, as in life, Matthew Perry was still teaching the world about the cost of addiction and the fragility of recovery. Matthew Perry's story doesn't end with the pool. It ends with the lives he touched. Fans who found courage in his openness, addicts who sought help because he showed them it was possible, and friends who remember not just Chandler Bing but the man behind the jokes. His death was accidental, but it was not meaningless. It became a warning, a catalyst, a conversation starter about addiction, recovery, and the thin line between healing and harm. He once wrote, "When I die, I don't want friends to be the first thing that's mentioned. I want helping people to be the first thing that's mentioned." And in many ways, that's exactly what happened. Matthew Perry was more than a sitcom star. He was a fighter, a survivor, and tragically, a reminder that recovery is not a straight line. It's a lifelong battle. His death shines a harsh light on the dangers of unchecked therapies, the persistence of addiction, and the need for compassion in how we treat those who struggle. But it also leaves us with a choice. Do we remember him only for the laughter? Or do we also carry forward his mission, to help others avoid the same fate? If Matthew Perry's story moved you, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Dark Dossier for more cases where truth hides in shadows, and where lives cut short still have lessons to teach. Like this video if you believe Perry's openness about addiction deserves to be honored. And hit the bell because in our next case file, we're uncovering another story where fame, pain, and tragedy collide. This has been Dark Dossier. Stay aware, stay human, and never forget the cost of silence.